Welcome to another episode of Mission Compliance, unleashing growth potential for defense contractors. In today's episode, we continue down the road of understanding CMMC, its regulations, and controls. Up next is IA.L2-3.5.3. Use multi-factor authentication for local and network access to privileged accounts and for network access to non-privileged accounts. We'll break down what this control means, why it matters, and how it impacts your organization's cybersecurity posture. We'll also provide practical insights and strategies for achieving compliance and securing your systems effectively. So whether you're a defense contractor aiming to win more contracts or simply someone interested in bolstering your cybersecurity knowledge, you're in the right place. Float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. We're joined once again today by Mike Frater, president of On-Call Compliance Solutions and a CMMC professional assessor who's playing with his camera. How you doing, Mike?
Yeah, sorry about that. I know, right in the middle of the podcast, but
It was it, I'm trying to read this intro. It's very distracting.
it's well, Roman, positioning is key, right? If you're not positioned correctly, then how can people see what's going on?
There you go. So, positioning in the market and positioning on the frame. So, Mike, this week we're talking about multi-factor authentication. And just before we started recording on this episode, you said this was the big one. So let's jump right into it. Why is this control important?
I think that multi-factor authentication is, at least in the early goings of 800.171, was one of the most hotly contested controls. When NIST first came out, and this is, you got to go back to 2016, 2017 when this thing came out and was being created, multi-factor authentication was controversial. It was not mainstream like it is today. People didn't understand it like they do today. And so as a result, they really felt strongly that, they didn't want it. They did not want it to be in place. Executives hated it. A lot of people just really felt like it was a huge hassle for not much gain, and they didn't really fully understand the gain that they had out of it. And ironically, multi-factor authentication is probably one of the single greatest security breakthroughs to ever happen. It really is a cool technology. It allows so that if someone has compromised your username and password, that they still can't get into a system because they will need a real-time revolving key or some other factor of authentication that cannot be a static item, so that they just can't get to you. And it was really getting to the point where hackers and cyber espionage was so effective at hacking people that it wasn't really a question about whether they could get into your email accounts or your systems or things like that. It was just a matter of, did you leave the door open? Um, I think multi-factor authentication is a really big piece of solving that problem. I can tell you that, we used to deal with attacks almost weekly, if not daily in some cases, where organizations were being hacked and the email was being taken over and it was a big giant mess. But all of that really more or less has kind of stopped. Well, it hasn't stopped, so don't get me wrong, it hasn't stopped, but it's greatly improved with the implementation of multi-factor authentication. And so now, with multi-factor authentication being mandated in the defense industry for those handling CUI, I got to tell you, people are much, much safer. The incidents of hacking and attacking are much better. It does not happen very often or at all when multi-factor authentication is in place. So I think it's incredibly, incredibly important, and just something that really can't be overstated. Now, a couple of nuances about the control. The control says use multi-factor authentication for local and network access to privileged accounts. So the first thing to understand is, if you are using an account with administrative privileges or escalated privileges, under those circumstances, even if it's just a local account, you've got to have multi-factor authentication just to even get into, if the CUI is held on the machine, or certainly any system that may contain CUI. Then it says for network access to non-privileged accounts. And so the difference in verbiage there is, if you are accessing CUI over a network. So let's say that you are, your local network, and you've got a map network drive or a share, or maybe even a SharePoint drive If you have access over a network to CUI, then you have to have multi-factor authentication. Um, yeah, you have to have it. There's no real way around that. But if you have a computer and it is a local computer and the data is local, I mean only stored on your hard drive, let's say in your My Documents, and your My Documents is not synced to a OneDrive and it's not going over a network somewhere, then in that circumstance, in that one circumstance, it is permissible to not have multi-factor authentication on the machine. I think primarily what this is really for is situations like in manufacturing when you have testing machines where the test data is not going anywhere besides that local machine. That would be one example. Or again, just the pure and simple example of it's not an administrative account. You've got CUI on it, and it exists in that profile, but the machine is not sharing it out as any kind of a share over a network. That would be one instance where it is permissible to not have multi-factor authentication. Generally speaking, our standard for our clients is everybody gets multi-factor authentication. We like Windows Hello. We like Duo. We like particularly a product called Gatekeeper, which uses RFID keys. All of those are really, really great solutions. I'll even tell you that I have a fingerprint reader on my primary machines where I access CUI to give me a biometric lock on the machine. It is a heck of a lot faster than entering in a password anyway. Um, and still to get into things like our Azure government accounts, we're using Microsoft's Authenticator and applications like that. So lots and lots and lots of ways to do it, but it is definitely mandatory under the scenarios of accessing CUI over a network or accessing it locally with a local administrator or a privileged account. And the same goes for other systems as well, and their equivalent user levels. So very, very important control. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about the resistance to this control a little bit later.
I was gonna say, I'd argue that you said it used to be controversial. I'd argue that for some people, it's still controversial because every once in a while, when I send out a marketing email that revolves around multi-factor authentication, which again, that's one of our favorite topics here, one of the most important topics here, it happens, every once in a while, I'll send one out, and a couple times I've gotten emails back was like, oh, not this again, multi-factor authentication's everywhere, blah 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 blah. So I would definitely say that there's still some pushback on multi-factor authentication for sure. Um, but with that being said, we are still talking about this in this episode, whether you're a fan of it or not. So, what are the key assessment points that an assessor be looking for on this one?
Yeah, so the assessment points are really quite interesting on this. It's not as straightforward as you would think. The first thing that they're looking for is they want you to determine if privileged accounts are identified. And you think to yourself, why is that an assessment point? And the reason is because they want to identify the accounts that are relevant for multi-factor authentication. So the fastest way to do that is to determine what are the accounts that are privileged. So again, we've already addressed this in Control Family 1, access control. And so again, this assessment point should be met very easily. Again, you can look in Active Directory Entra ID. Any kind of user management system is going to have who's privileged, who's not, who has permissions to what. The second assessment point, determine if multi-factor authentication is implemented for local access to privileged accounts, is kind of interesting. So we have to actually test multi-factor authentication. Is it implemented for all accounts able to access CUI? And again, that's what we're looking for. That's the answer to that. It should be implemented for all accounts that are able to access CUI. There's really not any kind of a better answer that you're looking for there. You just have to have it there. The next one is determine multi-factor authentication is implemented for network access to privileged accounts. And this is where we really get into the nuts and bolts. They're not talking about local machines. They're talking about any kind of multi-factor authentication to a network resource. So let's say you have a computer and you're trying to get at a resource that's on a server like a map network drive. You're going to need multi-factor authentication at a perimeter somewhere. It could be that you need MFA when you sign into the machine on the domain, or you need it if you're pulling up a resource that's out of the domain. So I think that's pretty critical. And even when you're picking up a resource in the domain, if for some reason your local machine doesn't have multi-factor authentication, if it's going to be given access to a map network drive, you're going to definitely need multi-factor authentication to be conditional access policy to access those resources. So again, the answer is all the same. It's that it's implemented, and when it says determined, they usually have to actually go in and look. So this is what I call a show and tell, usually using shoulder surfing or screen sharing. The final assessment point is determine if multi-factor authentication is implemented for network access to non-privileged accounts, making sure that even if you're not an admin or a privileged user, that you still have multi-factor authentication as a minimum mandatory requirement in order to access CUI over a network. And that includes over a local network as well. So yeah, those are the assessment points. Again, actually all four of those assessment points, there's no documentation that they're really looking for per se, although you should have it documented in your IT operations policy that multi-factor authentication is mandatory. But this is a determined control. So this is show and tell, this is shoulder surfing, we want to see that you actually have these things in place.
There you go. So now that we understand, a little bit more of the importance of multi-factor authentication and a little bit, of the assessment points, are there any potential difficulties in enacting this one in an organization, despite other than maybe just, pushback from people that don't like it?
Yeah, I have to tell you, I was working with a client even yesterday, and we're overseeing a very, very big Azure government virtual infrastructure implementation. And we were told by the client, hey, turn off multi-factor authentication at sign-in for these users. We're just trying to get our users from where they were in the commercial environment over into the government environment. And I said, whoa, 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 hang on, hang on. There's no reason for this environment to ever have multi-factor authentication turned off. And their rationale was we want to move the users into the environment with as low friction as possible, get them up and working, and then we'll turn on all the security stuff. I don't agree with that. Now again, they're not compliant right now anyway, so it doesn't matter, but I will just kind of tell you that multi-factor authentication is something that I think if you're spinning up a new system, whether it's Azure Gov, GCC High, or just some other system, right? Any online system, or even file shares. There is no reason anymore to not immediately implement multi-factor authentication. If you've got a user that's got a problem with their phone or they need something to make this work, the time to figure that out is before they get access to the system, not after they've got access and now we've got to go and backtrack who's got it, who doesn't. I'm just such a strong proponent of that in the IT strategy, which is if you're going to have MFA on a system and if you're standing up a new system, don't let someone circumvent this control. I strongly advocate for it. It's one of the things that's kept our company safe, our clients' companies safe. It really is that important of a security control. Look, you guys know me pretty well. I'm gonna tell you when I think a control is BS, right? And there's not very many of those in this whole thing. There's one or two that I think are a little silly. But I do not agree with the idea of circumventing multi-factor authentication, even on a temporary basis. I don't think it's necessary. It is worth the administrative overhead for the gain in security. Yeah, I don't know. I think again, 6, 7 years ago, the resistance was very, very tough. Even today, a lot of people really don't like the idea that they have to have this thing, this extra thing in the way of them signing on. But again, I just sort of advocate to people, listen, this is not a preference. This is a must. This is a security must do. Because again, hackers are amazingly talented out there. They can do brute force attacks that just try passwords over and over and over again. And with enough time, they will figure out your password. And then there's nothing else to stop them. The rolling code or the multiple factors of authentication, including things like who you are, or the device you have, those are really, really good security protocols. And having them work in combination so that there's multiple factors, that's the key to I think that's a big key to security. So yeah, look, for the executives out there that, want to complain about inconvenience, what's inconvenient is losing your defense work because you're not compliant. So to me, I think this is a very small price to pay. And ultimately, by now, most CEOs have kind of gotten with the program and realized this is here to stay. And it obviously is really, really good security because it's working.
Absolutely. So if you've been here with us for this long, which by the way, Mike, this is episode number 96, so we are really getting close to that milestone number.
We're getting
Uh,
there. We're getting there.
we got to start talking about what we're going to do for that episode. But until then, we like to finish off these podcasts with a silly question. And because this one is about multi-factor authentication, my silly question is this. What if, instead of a password or a code for multi-factor authentication, a user had to correctly answer an organizational related trivia question, such as when was the company founded, what city was it founded in, anything like that? What if the separate authentication was a trivia question?
That's a good question. So, one, that is used in password resets. So, of course, you get asked the secret question, right? Where'd you go to high school? What town were you born in? What was your mother's maiden name? That kind of stuff. So, it's very valid as far as a form of identification. However, it is right there with passwords, which is, a password is something that if it was to be exposed, including like if your answers were to be exposed to those silly questions, then at that point, a hacker could use them. The real key is you could use that as your password. I see no reason why you couldn't, but you would just need another form of authentication to complete multi-factor authentication. For instance, you might need either a biometric verification or perhaps a rolling code. But you've got to have something besides those questions. But certainly, I think from the perspective of replacing passwords with trivia answers, I see no problem with that. If that's how your system works, awesome. Let's rock and roll with it.
And that wraps up another great episode of Mission Compliance. We hope our discussion today has provided you with valuable insights, practical strategies, and inspiration to navigate the ever-evolving world of defense. We'd like to thank Mike for joining us for the 96th episode of Mission Compliance and talking out to us about the very, very important topic, which this will not be the last time we talk about this, of multi-factor authentication. Thanks, Mike.
Hey, always a pleasure, Roman.
But the conversation doesn't end here. We encourage you to continue exploring these topics and connect with us on our social media channels. Share your thoughts, ask questions, and engage with fellow listeners using the hashtag Mission Compliance Podcast. If they haven't already, what should they do, Mike?
Well, they should definitely like, subscribe, and most importantly, tell a fellow friend in the defense industry because they're trying to figure this out too.
And also, be sure to hit subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast platform so that you always know when new episodes like this one are released. We'd really appreciate it if you could also rate and review the show. Your feedback helps us to continue to bring you thought-provoking episodes and high-quality content. Join us next time as we delve further into the dynamic world of defense, security, and industry innovation. Until then, take care, stay informed, and make compliance your mission. See you next time.
Thanks, everybody.